Something almost threw me off the cliff. Something in the mountains almost threw me off the cliff. This is not an exaggeration, nor is it an attempt to create a dramatic horror story from thin air. This happened in December 2023, during the quiet lull when the rest of the world was busy preparing for the New Year festivities, and I found myself with a handful of extra vacation days. Those days were about to expire, and it felt like such a waste to let them slip through my fingers. Driven by some restless urge to escape the monotony of city life, I decided to use them all at once and embark on a trip to Kasol. For those who are not familiar with it, Kasol is a small hill station nestled deep in the Himalayas. It is known for its natural beauty, serene landscapes, and tranquil rivers. It is a place where one can gaze upon thick forests, listen to the murmuring streams, and soak in the crisp mountain air. I had recently acquired a brand new motorcycle, a Himalayan 450 that had barely touched the road. It had only about 600 kilometers on the odometer, so the engine was barely broken in. I was excited to give it a proper test, to truly feel the machine respond under challenging conditions. It seemed perfect. A journey through winding Himalayan roads, scenic vistas, and minimal interference from busy highways. The plan was straightforward. I would leave my apartment well before dawn, ride through the night to avoid the hustle of daytime traffic, and reach Kasol by morning. I told myself that traveling at night would be more exciting, that it would feel like a proper adventure rather than a simple tourist trip. Perhaps I was influenced by stories I had read, or maybe the idea of quiet highways beckoned me. In retrospect, that decision was a mistake, one of many small choices that would lead me into a terrifying encounter I could never have imagined. As I set off from the city, the first few hours were indeed peaceful. The world was asleep, and the roads were calm. I felt like I had the entire landscape to myself, slicing through the darkness, guided only by my bike's headlamp and the sparse highway lights. My pace was steady, not too fast and not too slow. By the time I reached the foothills of the Himalayas, it was around 2:30 a.m. My body felt the strain of continuous riding. The cold air began to sting my face even beneath my helmet and riding gear. I could feel my muscles stiffening, my shoulders tensing. The sense of isolation grew as I ascended the winding roads that curled around the mountain slopes. Still, I pressed on, hoping the journey would yield a unique memory, though I could never have guessed what kind. The darkness at that hour was profound. There were no city lights, no neon signs, no bustling crowd shone. There was just the moon and my headlight cutting a path through the gloom. The mountains rose on either side, tall and silent, like ancient guardians. The road was narrow and kept zigzagging upwards, and occasionally I would see a small signpost indicating a village or a landmark further ahead. But at that late hour, all human presence seemed to vanish. The trees stood tall, their silhouettes stark against the pale sky. My mind started to wander. I imagined snow leopards prowling unseen behind ridges or mysterious hermits meditating in hidden caves. After about 5 hours of relentless riding, fatigue began to settle into my bones. My hands trembled slightly from the continuous grip on the handlebars. The night air felt colder now, biting through my gloves, and my eyes struggled to stay fully open. I had been awake for a long time, and the absence of other travelers made the journey feel oddly suspended, as if I were drifting through another world. That was when I noticed a tiny electric lamp glimmering in the distance. At first, I thought it was a hallucination brought on by my exhaustion, but as I approached, I realized it was indeed a small stall. The sign of life was a massive relief. I desperately needed a hot cup of chai, something warm and comforting to help me push on. I carefully parked my bike on an upward slope, making sure it was in first gear so it would not roll backward. The place where the vendor had set up his little makeshift tea stall was on a bend in the road, and the gradient was quite steep. The vendor was a local man, probably in his late 30s. He had a simple moped parked nearby. He did not look surprised to see me, but he did seem curious. He explained that he stayed open late at night because army trucks frequently passed through this route and sometimes stopped for tea. We exchanged a few words, friendly and lighthearted. The aroma of the brewing tea, the faint hum of insects, and the distant rustle of leaves combined to create a strangely comforting atmosphere. As we spoke, I allowed my mind to relax a bit. I sipped the chai, grateful for its warmth. It felt wonderful against my numb lips and fingertips. I was just starting to think that maybe my night ride was not such a bad idea after all, when suddenly, the vendor's demeanor shifted. He stopped mid-sentence, raised his hand abruptly, and signaled me to remain silent. His eyes flicked upward, toward his simple stove setup. He did not need to say anything. The panic in his gaze was enough to set my heart pounding. Confused, I followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual. Then, I heard it, a faint sound carried by the mountain breeze. It sounded like singing, soft, distant, and eerie. It came from above us, somewhere high up the cliff face that towered over the road. The melody, if one could call it that, was haunting and slow. There was no logical explanation for anyone to be up there. The cliff was nearly vertical, the kind of rock face that even expert climbers would struggle to ascend without proper gear. Certainly, nobody would be perched there at this hour, singing in the darkness. The vendor's face contorted in fear. He grabbed my elbow, leaned close, and said, "Sir, run quick." His voice was low and urgent. Without waiting for me to respond, he sprang onto his mope, fumbled with the ignition for a split second, then sped away downhill, vanishing around the bend and into the blackness below. I was left standing there, dumbfounded. A moment ago we were chatting casually, and now I was alone again, confronted with something entirely outside my realm of understanding. The singing grew louder. My mind raced. Could it be a group of travelers lost on the ridge above? Could it be a trick of the wind? Perhaps local villagers performing some midnight ritual? Nothing made sense. The vendor's reaction was not theatrical. It was raw panic. Something was wrong. Dangerously wrong. I felt a surge of adrenaline, and suddenly the hairs on my arms stood on end. Just then, a voice thundered down from above. "Stay where you are." That voice was undeniably human, yet filled with such rage and authority that it sent a jolt of electricity through my spine. It spoke in clear, angry tones, as though furious that I was even present. I knew at that instant that obeying that command was the last thing I should do. Something told me that if I stayed, I would regret it. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to leave immediately. I flicked my half-finished cigarette onto the ground, scrambled for my keys, and rushed to my bike. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the ignition. The fear was so intense that I could hardly think straight. I realized the road behind me was not an option. The vendor had fled downhill, and trying to turn my bike around in such a tight space, on such a steep incline, would be nearly impossible. On my left was a sheer drop. On my right, a towering cliff wall. Ahead of me was the upward road, my only route to escape. I had to press forward, deeper into the unknown darkness. I took a deep breath, clenched my jaw, and twisted the throttle. The bike roared, its engine echoing off the canyon walls, and I surged uphill. As I sped forward, panic and disbelief churned in my mind. The voice above started shouting again, yelling curses that I could not fully make out. It seemed to be following me, keeping pace with my ascent. The notion was impossible. How could anyone or anything move so swiftly along the top of a nearly vertical cliff, parallel to my path? The rational part of my mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe there was a hidden path up there. Maybe multiple people were running with torches. Or perhaps it was some kind of elaborate scam to scare travelers. But another part of me, the one gripped by pure animal terror, insisted that what I was dealing with was not normal. I pressed on the accelerator, careful not to lose control. The road was becoming trickier, with tighter curves and more patches of frost. The altitude was rising, and my lungs noticed the thinning air. The temperature felt like it had dropped even lower. My speed hovered around 40 kilometers per hour, which was already risky on these bends. Going faster might send me flying over the edge, but going slower would allow whatever was up there to close the distance. I could feel its presence looming above, as though the entity possessed inhuman agility and speed. The singing started again, but this time it was closer, more defined. It no longer sounded like distant chanting. Instead, it resembled a cacophony of multiple voices singing different notes all at once, like some twisted chorus. My heart hammered against my ribcage. My breaths were shallow. I tried to focus on the road to keep the bike steady. The darkness seemed thicker now, as if the very air had conspired to trap me. Eventually, I spotted a straight stretch of road ahead. I realized that if I could gain speed there, I might put some distance between myself and whatever horror pursued me from above. I twisted the throttle as far as I dared. The bike responded with a growl, and I surged forward. But at the end of that straight stretch was a sharp bend to the right. In my desperate attempt to outrun the unimaginable, I entered the bend too fast. I felt the anti-lock braking system kick in, a jolt that shook the handlebars. The tires lost grip momentarily on a patch of frost. The bike wobbled and threatened to topple. In a panicked move, I pulled the clutch incorrectly and stalled the engine. Suddenly, I was stationary, vulnerable, and exposed. At that exact moment, I heard the unmistakable sound of loose stones tumbling down the cliff face. My eyes darted upward. What I saw then is something that has been seared into my memory forever. There was a figure, or rather, a shape, pitch black against the faint starlight. It was descending the cliff at a horrifying speed, moving with a fluidity and agility no human could possess. It had multiple limbs, 5 or 6, I could not tell, and it crawled like a monstrous insect rather than a person. The silhouette was distorted, unnatural, and terrifying. I attempted to restart my engine, my fingers shaking so badly that I struggled to find the ignition switch. Before I could react, the thing launched itself into the air. It leaped from the cliff face and hurtled straight towards me. The impact was immediate and violent. One of its clawed limbs struck my shoulder, sending a bolt of pain through my arm. Another limb slammed into the bike's fuel tank, denting it with a sickening metallic crunch. The force was so great that it knocked me and the bike sideways, sliding toward the edge of the cliff. I hit the guardrail with a bone-jarring thud. My bike came down on top of me, pinning my legs. My mind exploded with panic. I struggled to breathe. My shoulder burned with pain. I expected the creature to follow through, to tear into me with claws or teeth, but as I craned my neck, I saw it tumble over the guardrail, off the cliff's edge. It disappeared into the night, falling into the abyss below. For a brief second, I waited for the sound of it hitting the ground far below. Some gruesome thump signaling that the nightmare had ended. No sound came, no impact, no final exhalation. Nothing but silence and the faint rustle of wind through the pines. That silence was worse than any scream. It implied the unimaginable, that this creature could somehow defy the laws of nature, that it could survive a fall off a Himalayan cliff. My heart pounded, and tears welled in my eyes, not from pain alone but from pure terror and disbelief. As I lay there, trapped under my bike, I noticed a glow approaching from downhill. Headlights, the roar of a diesel engine, the squeal of brakes. In a moment that felt surreal, an army truck rumbled to a stop behind me. Soldiers leaped out, shouting. At first, they assumed I had crashed my bike in a simple accident. They rushed to lift the motorcycle off my legs. Their voices were urgent but kind, and I clung to their presence like a lifeline. I was still in shock, barely able to form coherent sentences. They checked me for injuries and found only bruises and a dented shoulder pad on my riding jacket. My shoulder throbbed, but nothing seemed broken. They helped me stand, and I stammered out the unbelievable story. To my astonishment, they did not laugh or roll their eyes. They exchanged knowing glances. One of them sighed heavily and shook his head. Another muttered something under his breath. Then one soldier explained that there were local legends about entities known as forest witches, sometimes referred to as Dakans. These beings supposedly dwelled in remote mountain areas, preying on unsuspecting travelers, especially those foolhardy enough to traverse these roads at night. He said villagers had whispered such stories for generations. They spoke of creatures that could scale cliffs as easily as insects crawl on walls, creatures that could mimic human voices or produce haunting melodies to lure their victims. I was stunned. My rational mind rebelled against the idea of forest witches and monstrous cliff dwellers. Yet I had just experienced something beyond all logic. The soldiers assured me that I was not the first to report such an encounter, though it was rare for anyone to come face to face with the creature and survive. They urged me not to travel alone at night in these parts. One soldier joked, half-heartedly, that I was lucky the Dakan did not fancy my taste. Another told me that some people believe these entities have lived in these mountains for centuries, older than the oldest trees, and that they feed on the fear and confusion of their prey. I followed their truck up the pass until we reached a small army outpost. In the first hints of dawn, the mountains looked serene and peaceful, as if the horrors of the night were just a bad dream. But my aching shoulder and the dented fuel tank on my bike told a different story. Under the growing light, I examined the damage. The tank bore a deep impression where that creature had struck it. The memory of its multitude of limbs flashed through my mind again, and a wave of nausea hit me. To this day, I can still picture it. Black against the starlight, limbs splayed out like an unnatural spider. A hateful presence that did not belong in our rational world. The soldiers treated me kindly. They gave me some warm tea and first aid for my bruises. I tried to piece together what had happened, but even now I struggle to comprehend it. Could it really have been a supernatural entity? Was it some unknown species of animal mutated by harsh conditions? Or was it something else entirely? A phenomenon beyond our scientific understanding. There are places in this world that remain mysterious, ancient corners where human knowledge is incomplete. The Himalayas are full of myths and legends. Perhaps some of them are more than just stories. When I finally continued my journey in the daylight, the road felt different. I noticed more details. The texture of the cliff faces, the patterns of fallen rocks, the subtle signs warning of landslides. I passed through small villages and saw local children running and playing, unaware of the night's terrors. I felt humbled and strangely vulnerable, as though I had been given a glimpse behind the curtain of normal reality. Upon reaching Kasol, I tried to relax and enjoy my vacation, but the memory haunted me. Every time I looked at my bike, the dent in the fuel tank reminded me of that violent impact. Sometimes I caught myself scanning the mountaintops, half expecting to see a black shape crawling unnaturally along a ridge. At night, when I closed my eyes, I would hear that singing echoing in my ears, remembering the way it seeped into my mind and set my nerves on edge. I returned home after that trip a changed person. Before this incident, I would have dismissed such stories as superstition. I was not the sort to believe in ghosts, witches, or mystical creatures. Yet now I found myself unable to dismiss them so easily. Something had attacked me, something beyond my understanding. I never found a logical explanation. The soldier's reaction alone convinced me that I was not the only one who had encountered these things. In the weeks that followed, I scoured the internet for accounts of strange sightings in the Himalayas. I found scattered reports, travelers who spoke of eerie singing at night, villagers who warned outsiders not to wander alone after dark, and ancient legends passed down through generations. The details varied, but the sense of dread was consistent. I read about people who claimed to see impossible footprints on steep cliffs, or to hear voices calling them from dangerous ledges. Every story I found only deepened my conviction that there are things out there we cannot explain. The rational part of me still tries to find another explanation. Perhaps there were smugglers or criminals using clever tricks to scare travelers away. Maybe it was a large, deformed animal driven mad by hunger. But such explanations feel hollow. Nothing can explain the way that creature moved, the way it fell without making a sound, and the way its presence seemed to distort the very atmosphere around me. I also thought about the tea vendor who fled that night. He had recognized the danger immediately. He had probably heard stories and knew the warning signs. His quick escape was a survival tactic. I realized how vulnerable I had been, riding alone without knowledge of local lore. In a way, that vendor saved my life by urging me to flee. Had I stayed behind out of curiosity or disbelief, I might not be here today to tell this story. Today I still ride motorcycles, but I have changed my habits. I will never again ride through remote mountain roads at night, unless it is absolutely necessary. Knowledge is part of survival, and I respect the mountains more than ever. I understand that they are not just scenic landscapes for my amusement. They are ancient environments with their own secrets and guardians, and I am just a visitor passing through. If anyone reading this plans to venture into remote areas, take my warning seriously. Respect local legends and heed the advice of locals. There may be more truth in their stories than you realize. Our modern world often blinds us to the mysteries that still linger in quiet corners. When we venture too far into the unknown, we might encounter things that challenge our understanding of reality. I think back to the night of the incident, the chill in the air, the gloom of the cliffs, the soft singing that turned into screams. I remember the terror of seeing that impossible shape crawling down the cliff face with inhuman grace. I remember the impact, the pain, and the silence that followed. Most of all, I remember the relief and disbelief when I saw the army truck headlights sweeping over the curve, like a beacon of hope in a nightmare. Without that timely arrival, who knows what would have happened next. Even now, I can close my eyes and picture the exact spot on the road where the creature attacked me. I can see the bend, the sparse trees, the jagged rocks. It is all etched into my mind. The Himalayan night sky was filled with countless stars, indifferent to my plight. That indifference is part of nature's mystery. Mountains do not care about human struggles. They simply are. And within them roam creatures and forces we have yet to understand. The soldiers who believed me did so because they had their own stories, their own encounters. They shared tales of truck drivers who refused to drive at certain hours, of patrols that heard laughter coming from nowhere, and of whispering voices carried by the wind. They tried to explain that not everything can be rationalized with modern reasoning. Some things are better respected and avoided. In the quiet days that followed, as I sat by my dented bike and traced the mark on the fuel tank with my fingers, I realized that the object beneath my hand was more than just metal bent out of shape. It was evidence, a solid reminder that something very real, very tangible, and very dangerous had collided with me. This was no hallucination or nightmare. It happened. That dent could have been my grave marker if events had taken a different turn. I have reflected on why I survived. Perhaps I was simply lucky. Perhaps the creature miscalculated its leap. Or perhaps it was startled by the sudden arrival of the army truck. Maybe it never intended to kill me, only to scare me. But such guesses are futile. All I know is that I got a second chance, and I have not taken it lightly. Months later, I still find my thoughts drifting back to that road. I have considered visiting the vendor during daylight, trying to find out what he knows, but part of me does not want to return anywhere near that place. Memories alone are terrifying enough. I prefer to keep my distance, to move forward with the understanding that the world is bigger and stranger than I ever imagined. My journey to Kasol taught me an unforgettable lesson about humility and respect for places I do not fully understand. Now, I do not question old legends so readily. I acknowledge that not all knowledge is recorded in our books or accessible through our devices. Some knowledge lives in whispered warnings, in the cautious practices of locals who have learned to coexist with the unknown. I am grateful that I walked away from this encounter alive and relatively unharmed. Many others might not be so fortunate. In the end, all I can do is share my story. By doing so, perhaps I can provide some measure of awareness and caution. The Himalayas, and by extension any wild remote region, may hold secrets that defy reason. If you ever find yourself traveling these roads at night, remember my experience. If you hear soft singing from impossible heights, if you sense a presence that should not be there, trust your instincts. Turn back, seek shelter, or wait until dawn. Life is too precious, and no thrill is worth gambling your safety against forces you cannot comprehend. I still ride my motorcycle, feeling the wind and the freedom it offers. But I have learned my lesson about choosing where and when to ride. I respect the tales of haunted passes and remote forests. I know that every legend, no matter how fanciful, might contain a kernel of truth. Sometimes that kernel is more than a metaphor. Sometimes it is a living, breathing horror, perched on a cliff, waiting for the unwary traveler. So I hold these memories close and hope that others will heed this cautionary tale. There is more to the world than meets the eye. There are heights we cannot climb and voices we cannot understand. In these hidden corners lurk entities that challenge our perception of reality. What happened to me on that mountain road was not a dream. It was a stark reminder that we are not always the masters of our domain. There are places where human dominance falters, where our logic fails, and where something else holds sway. And for that reason, I will never ride in the mountains at night, ever again.